The soup is almost ready. She can tell by the smell. Navy beans gone soft and smoky. A bay leaf she found pressed between the pages of a journal. Dried thyme from the shelf above the desk. The cast iron pot fits the stove burner as if it was made for it, which it probably was. Most things in this room fit. That still surprises her, even now, even after 3 months of learning the place the way you learn a language. One word at a time, then whole sentences, then one morning you realize you've been thinking in it. The kerosene lamp is burning clean. She trimmed the wick this morning, the way she trims it every morning, and the light it throws is steady and warm and fills every corner of the long chamber, without trying too hard. On the steel door behind her, her initials are drying in the paint she traded 2 afternoons of fence mending to obtain. A small tin of barn red enamel, bought from the rancher's supply shelf for what she'd earned with her hands. The letters are not ornate, they don't need to be. They are the first permanent mark she has ever put on anything in the world, and they are exactly the right size. Outside the canyon wall, late October is doing what October does at elevation, stripping the scrub oak bare, pushing cold air down from the ridgeline in long, slow waves, shortening the afternoon until the light goes thin and copper by 3 o'clock. Inside the dam, none of that touches her. The concrete is 4 feet thick. The stove handles the rest. She stirs the soup. How does a person end up here? Inside the wall of an abandoned dam, 40 feet above a dry riverbed, in a canyon most people in the county couldn't locate on a map and wouldn't bother to. How does a room that no one has slept in since 1971 become the safest place a person has ever known? The answer is not short. It is not clean. It involves a road atlas with the last 12 pages missing, a wrong turn taken in the flat heat of late July, a dry riverbed that ran between limestone walls, like something that had once known where it was going, and then simply stopped. It involves a steel door, round and green with oxidation, cracked open just enough to let out a thread of light that had no business existing. It involves 4 months of work she has not finished thinking about yet. She pulls the pot to the cooler edge of the stove and sets the lid ajar. Steam rises and curls against the ceiling of the gallery, against concrete that was poured in 1942 by one man, who understood that a structure could hold more than water, that it could hold a life, if you built the room right and sealed the door against the wrong kinds of weather. She had to find that out herself. It started with the riverbed. It started with the riverbed. She had come off the highway 2 days before, because the shoulder was too narrow, and the trucks too fast, and the sun by 9 in the morning was the kind of flat white that made the asphalt ahead look like standing water. The atlas showed a road cutting northeast through the mountains, and she took it, and the road became gravel, and the gravel became 2 ruts in pale dust, and the ruts ended at a cattle gate that was padlocked shut. She went around it. That was a habit by then. The dry river appeared below a cut in the rock, not gradually but all at once, the way terrain in canyon country works, giving you nothing and then giving you everything in a single step. One moment she was on open slope in full sun. The next she was standing on smooth white stones, 10 degrees cooler, inside walls of cream-colored limestone that rose 30 feet on either side. The riverbed was wide enough to walk without turning sideways, and empty in the way only a watercourse that has been dry for years goes empty. Clean scoured, bleached, with small drifts of wind-blown grit settled into the pockets between stones. She walked because it was shade. That was the whole reason, and it was enough. The canyon bent to the left. Then it bent again, tighter this time, and the walls came closer, and the light above narrowed to a bright strip, and she walked around that second curve and stopped. The dam sat at the head of the canyon like something that had always been there, and had stopped expecting to be found. Concrete, gray going brown at its edges, 40 feet of it rising from the canyon floor, to a straight crest that caught the sky. Its face was not smooth. She could see the ridges where the forms had been, faint and regular. And somewhere near the base, a seam of old water staining marked the high water line from a reservoir that no longer existed. The upstream side was dry canyon. The downstream side was her. She stood still and took it in the way she took in everything that mattered, completely, before moving. Iron rungs were set into the face in a vertical line, old and orange with rust, but still present, still anchored. She counted them from the base. 12 feet up, the rungs ended at a circular form set into the concrete. A door, perhaps 3 feet across, its steel surface gone green and gray with oxidation, the color of something that had stopped caring about the weather. It was cracked open, not much, 2 inches, perhaps 3. And behind the gap, behind that narrow, dark seam in 40 feet of concrete, and hillside and mountain, there was light. Not daylight, not reflection. Something amber, faint, the color a lantern makes when the fuel is almost gone and the wick barely catches. The color of something that had been burning, somehow, for longer than she could yet understand. She did not move for a full minute. She moved before she decided to move. That was how it always went with things that mattered. The body made its choice, and the mind caught up somewhere on the way. The first rung took her weight with a sound like a tooth being tested. She paused. It held. The second was worse, filmed with a thin orange grit that came off on her palms, but the iron beneath it was solid, the mortar around its base uncracked. She climbed the way she climbed everything, testing each hold, shifting her weight slowly, reading the structure the way it wanted to be read, rather than the way she wanted to read it. 12 feet, her face level with the door. Up close, the steel was extraordinary. Every inch of it mapped in oxidation, green and pewter, and a dark reddish brown, where moisture had worked along the seam. The gap where it stood open was perhaps 2.5 inches, enough to get her fingers around the edge. She pulled, slowly, and felt the resistance of a hinge that had not moved in years. Then it moved. A groan that she felt through her palms more than heard, low and metallic and completely serious. The door swung outward another 6 inches before she stopped it. The smell came first. Kerosene, not fresh but present, layered beneath it the dry mineral cold of stone that never sees sun, and something underneath both of those, old wool, old wood, the particular stillness of a room that has been sealed against weather for a long time and has simply continued being itself in the dark. She looked in without entering. A cot along the left wall, steel-framed, a dark blanket folded at one end. Shelves along the right, their contents in shadow but unmistakably organized. Cans, jars, shapes she could not yet name. A stove, small, cast iron, its pipe disappearing up through the ceiling of the chamber. A desk at the far end, and above it, a lantern hanging from a shelf hook. Its flame so low, it was less light than memory of light. Amber and barely there, burning on whatever the wick could still find. She looked for a long time. Then she pulled the door back to its previous position, 2.5 inches, no more, and climbed down. She circled the dam twice in what was left of the afternoon light, walking slowly, pressing her palm flat against the concrete every few yards, feeling for the wrongness she knew to feel for, hollow resonance, crumbling aggregate, the soft give of compromised structure. She found none of it. The downstream face was solid throughout. The base showed no undermining, no subsidence, no lateral shift. She made camp at the cliff wall, 20 feet from the base of the dam. Sleeping bag rolled out on flat stone, backpack against the rock behind her shoulder. She ate the last of her crackers and looked up at the place where the door was, invisible now in the dark. She needed to be sure. That was all. She needed to be sure. She started at first light, before the canyon warmed. The method was the same she'd used the night before, but slower now, more deliberate. One palm flat against the concrete, the other balled at her side, moving laterally, in 18-inch increments across the full downstream face. Pressing, listening with her hand, then tapping, knuckle rap, reading the return. Concrete tells you what it knows. She had learned that from nothing more than paying attention. A gas station in Nevada, where the owner had pointed out a cracked apron, with the same quiet certainty a doctor uses to point at an X-ray. Hear that? Hollow underneath. Feel the difference? She had felt it then, and she felt for it now, working upward from the base in horizontal passes, left to right, right to left. The cracks near the door were surface only, hairline spalling from thermal cycling, decades of freeze and thaw, working the outermost layer loose, without touching the mass beneath. She pressed her fingertips into the widest one, barely fit a nail. Beneath the weathered skin, the dam was monolithic, indifferent, solid, the way only something built with real conviction can be solid. She concluded at the door. The latch was a simple lever mechanism, corroded but operable. She worked it twice to feel the action, then swung the round door fully open, 3 feet of steel moving on reluctant hinges, and went through. Cool air met her like a fact. Outside, the canyon was already climbing toward 90 degrees. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately, the thermal mass of 40 feet of concrete doing what it had always done, holding the cold of winter inside the rock long past the season that made it. She stood still for a moment and let her eyes adjust. The lantern on the floor gave almost nothing now, a suggestion of orange at the wick base. She found the fuel tin on the lowest shelf, half full, kerosene by smell, and filled the reservoir carefully, tilting the lantern level, watching the fluid rise. When she replaced the wick cap and turned it up, the light came back, steady, amber, filling the long chamber with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. She looked at the room, shelves along both walls, the stove, cold and dark, the desk at the far end, everything in its place, everything dusty but unbroken, sealed and waiting, with the patience of objects that have never been asked to be anything other than what they are. She sat on the cot. The wool blanket was folded at the foot. The mattress was thin but intact. She put her hands on her knees and looked at the lamp on the floor and listened to the quiet, which was the deepest quiet she had been inside in 4 months. No highway sound, no shelter noise, no low-current hum of danger that she had carried so long she had stopped naming it. It was gone. She noticed its absence the way you notice the moment rain stops. She stayed on the cot long enough for the lantern to settle into its steady rhythm. Then she moved to the desk. It was a plain thing, plank top, 2 drawers, the wood dark with hand oil along the edges where someone had gripped it again and again over many years. The top drawer held pencils worn to stubs, a steel ruler, a compass with a brass hinge. The bottom drawer was deeper and heavier, and when she pulled it open, she found 3 cloth-bound journals stacked flat, a folded sheet of drafting paper laid across the top of them like a cover. She set the drafting paper aside. The journals were numbered on the spine in black ink, 1, 2, 3. She opened the first. The handwriting was small and angular, an engineer's hand, disciplined, accustomed to labeling things rather than describing them. The early pages were almost purely technical, aggregate ratios, pour schedules, curing temperatures, dates logged with the precision of someone who believed time was a variable that needed controlling. She read quickly, skimming the numbers, following the shape of what the words were building. A small concrete gravity dam, 40 feet of lift, commissioned by a local water district for irrigation rights in the canyon. One man doing the engineering, the supervision, the finishing work. One man staying on afterward as caretaker, because that was the arrangement. Residency in exchange for maintenance. Agreed upon in writing. A clause buried in the district's founding charter. The middle section of the first journal was where the handwriting loosened, less labeling, more noticing. He wrote about the sound the canyon made in wind. He wrote about a hawk that nested on the east rim for 3 seasons running. He wrote about the inspection gallery, how he had looked at it the first winter and understood that it was, structurally speaking, the safest space in the valley, and how that understanding had become something else, something he didn't name directly, but circled carefully with words like adequate and sufficient and once mine. She moved to the second journal without putting the first one down. The water district had dissolved. She found that in the early pages, a flat entry, 2 sentences, the date underlined. The district folded in 1958, but he stayed. He repaired the things that needed repairing. He kept the sluice gate clear of sediment. He filled the journals with what he saw, and built and thought, as though the record itself was a form of maintenance, a way of proving the dam was still inhabited, still attended, still worth the attention. By the third journal, the handwriting had stiffened with age, but it was still precise. He was writing about the canyon as though introducing it to someone who had not yet arrived. She set the journals on the desk and looked at the room, the stove, the shelves, the cot where she had been sitting. She thought about a man who had built himself a place inside the most permanent thing he could make, and then refused to leave it. She thought she understood that. She opened the leather folder last. It was tucked behind the third journal, flat against the back of the desk's center drawer, and it smelled of the same damp mineral cold that the whole room smelled of, limestone and old paper and time. The flap was stiff. She worked it open carefully, the way she'd learned to handle anything that might be the last of its kind. Inside, a sheaf of correspondence, folded once along the horizontal. Letters to and from the County Water Authority, dated across 2 decades, 1942 through 1961. She read them in order. The early ones were practical, materials requisitions, inspection schedules, aggregate calculations for the concrete pour. By the mid-50s, the tone had shifted. The Water Authority's letters grew shorter, more administrative. His replies grew longer, more careful. By 1959, he was writing to an office that had already stopped answering. The final letter in the sequence was dated March 1961, addressed to no one in particular, and began, "For the record, as no other record appears to be kept." She almost missed the deed. It was folded inside the last letter, the way you'd fold a receipt into a bill. A single page, dense with county language, dated July 1941. The grantee was the Harrow Creek Municipal Water District. The parcel, approximately 340 acres, bounded on the north and east by the canyon rim, on the south by the old river course, on the west by the surveyed watershed divide. She read it once to understand the words, then again to understand what they meant, then a third time to be sure she wasn't misreading the part where no subsequent transfer appeared. No sale, no reversion, no reindexing. Only the original conveyance, sitting in a dead man's desk in a room no county map acknowledged. She set the deed on the table and held her hands flat on either side of it, as though it might move. The water district had folded in 1958. She knew that from the journal. She cross-referenced it now against the letters, found the exact date in a brief, formal notice, tucked between 2 routine inspections. Dissolution effective, January 1, 1959. After that, nothing. No transfer of assets, no assignment of property. The deed had simply fallen through the gap between one institution's end and the next administration's beginning, and no one had gone looking for it in the 37 years since. She sat with that for a long time. Outside, the canyon was doing what canyons do at dusk, cooling faster than the air above it, pulling sound downward, amplifying the small. She could hear wind somewhere high on the rim, She could hear her own breathing. The land had no current owner on paper. The deed named a district that no longer existed, and the only person who had ever lived here, who had tended this place and recorded its condition and written its history, as though someone would eventually need to read it, had left all of it in this drawer. She looked at the room again. Then she looked at the deed. She folded the deed carefully, the way she'd learned to fold paper that mattered, along existing creases, no new ones, and tucked it into the leather folder with the correspondence. Then she slept. By first light, she was already an hour down the canyon. The walk to town took 2 hours on a good day. This was a good day, cool, overcast. The kind of flat light that makes distances readable. She moved fast, keeping to the dry riverbed where the footing was honest, then cutting east along a ranch road once the canyon opened into scrubland. Her shoes were wearing through on the right heel. She noticed this the way she noticed everything, filed it, kept moving. The courthouse was a single-story building the color of old cream, with a hand-painted directory inside the door. Records, room 4. The clerk was a woman somewhere between 50 and 60, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and a desk stacked in a way that suggested its own internal logic. She looked up when the door opened, registered the backpack, registered the canvas and the dust, and said nothing about either. "I'm trying to trace a property deed," the girl said. "Filed under a water district that dissolved. I think the parcel was never re-indexed after." The clerk's expression shifted. Not suspicion, but the specific attention of someone who has encountered a real question. "Which district?" She gave her the name. Watched the clerk write it down. What followed was not fast. The clerk pulled 2 ledgers, then a third. She disappeared into a back room and came out with a flat cardboard box. She cross-referenced dates, ran her finger down columns of numbers, paused, went back. The girl stood at the counter and waited, because waiting was something she was good at. "Here," the clerk said finally, turning a ledger to face her. "District dissolved, assets pending reassignment. Reassignment never completed." The parcel was supposed to be re-indexed under the county's general land holdings in 1979 when they reorganized the old district records. She tapped the page. It wasn't. So it exists. The parcel exists. The deed exists. The ownership question is, she paused, choosing the word carefully, unresolved. She was not told she could have it. She was not told she couldn't. The clerk photocopied the relevant pages, 3 sheets, and wrote out, in clear block letters, the sequence of steps required to file a formal occupancy claim with the county land office. There was a process. It was slow and involved affidavits and a waiting period, and a posted notice of intent. It was not simple, but it was a process. It existed. Someone had written it down. She folded the photocopy into the leather folder she'd carried down from the dam. Thanked the clerk, who nodded once and returned to her ledgers. Outside, the overcast had thickened. The walk back was 2 hours. She started it with the folder under her arm, and the list memorized already. She'd read it 4 times at the counter, moving west, back toward the canyon, and the sound of wind on limestone. She was back at the dam before dusk, the folder pressed flat against her ribs under her jacket, where the wind couldn't get at it. She did not rest. She set the folder on the writing desk, weighted it with the civil engineering handbook, and turned to face the shelves. Every item, everything. She started at the left wall and worked right, lifting each can, reading each label, setting it back in order. 16 cans of sardines, 8 of baked beans, 11 of condensed milk, 4 of tomatoes, a paper bag of dried lentils gone hard as gravel but still sealed, a tin of coffee, nearly full, salt in a clay pot with a fitted lid. She wrote the inventory in the margin of her road atlas, the only blank paper she had, in small, column-tight script that wasted nothing. Then the tools. A hand saw with a slightly sprung blade, still usable, a short pry bar, a mallet, 3 flat files, a coil of wire she tested for brittleness by bending a length of it twice. It held. A canvas roll of chisels, each one wrapped separately in oiled cloth, each one still sharp. She laid them out on the cot in order of size, and examined them the way she had once watched a mechanic examine engine parts, not for what was wrong, but for what was still right. The stovepipe next. She'd noticed the gap 3 days earlier, near the second elbow, a separation of about 2 finger widths, where the sections had shifted. Cold air breathed through it in a way that the fire couldn't overcome. She cut a strip from a sardine can with her folding knife, crimped the edges against the pipe, and sealed it with a ring of wire twisted tight with the pliers. She lit a small fire after, and held her palm near the joint. The draft ran clean. Nothing leaked. The drying rack took longer. The 2 rods were hardwood, dry as chalk, bundled with a strip of rubber that crumbled when she touched it. She lashed them instead between 2 shelf brackets she unscrewed from the lowest shelf, 4 wraps of wire, twisted and tucked, and hung the result across the upper corner of the chamber near the pipe. She tested it with her jacket. It held. It was full dark by the time she went outside. She climbed the downstream face with both hands on the concrete, feeling for holds she'd already mapped by habit, and pulled herself up onto the canyon shelf. She'd noticed it from below. From above, standing on it, she understood it differently. The shelf was wide, 8 feet, perhaps 10 at the broadest point. Decomposed granite, a southern face. The limestone walls on either side would hold heat through September, maybe longer. She knelt and worked a handful of the soil between her palms. It was thin, but it was real. She went back down, opened the atlas to the page that covered this range, and wrote a single word in the margin beside the canyon mark. Garden. She heard them before she saw them, a dry shuffling and the occasional knock of hoof on stone somewhere above, moving along the canyon rim in the early morning, while the air was still cool enough to see her breath. She climbed up to look. 4 cattle, black-bodied, picking at the sparse grass between juniper scrub, and behind them, working along the fence line with a pair of pliers and a roll of wire, a man, older, deliberate in his movements, wearing a canvas jacket, the same faded brown as the rock. He saw the smoke first. She watched him stop and stare at the pipe, emerging from the dam face below, the thin thread of gray rising from it. He stood for a long moment before he looked up and found her on the rim. Neither of them spoke right away. She climbed down to him along the outside of the canyon wall, taking her time, and when she reached the flat ground where he stood, she had the deed photocopy folded in her jacket pocket. She'd put it there that morning without quite knowing why. He listened without interrupting. She told him what she'd found, the door, the room, the journals, the stove, and she said it plainly, without apology or embellishment. When she was done, she unfolded the photocopy and held it out. He looked at it for a while. Then he looked at the dam. He was quiet, she thought, but not unfriendly. He remembered the caretaker, said the man had come and gone from town, maybe twice a year. Hardware, dry goods, not much else. Never caused trouble. Died sometime in the early 70s, he thought, and after that the dam just sat. When the water district folded, he'd figured someone would sort out the land. Nobody ever did. He didn't ask her what she planned to do. He didn't tell her to leave. What he said was, "That fence needs mending." He pointed along the rim, 50 yards of sagging wire, 2 posts leaning outward where the frost had heaved them. His cattle had been getting through for weeks. If she could help him work the posts back and restring the wire, he had dried beans he couldn't use fast enough, and 2 seed packets he'd bought in the spring and never got around to planting. Squash and kale. Late enough in the season it was a gamble, he said, but the canyon shelf she was looking at faced south, and south-facing canyons surprised you sometimes. She worked beside him through the morning. He drove the posts, She stretched wire and secured the staples. They didn't talk much, just the specific language of the task. Hold it there, now twist, and the sound of the pliers working. When they were done, he handed her the bag and the seed packets without ceremony. She thanked him. He nodded once and turned to collect his cattle. She planted the squash and kale the next morning on the canyon shelf, pressing seeds into soil she had loosened with the flat of the trowel, watering them from the chamber's small reserve. Then she turned to the sluice gate. The journals described the mechanism across 9 careful pages, with penciled diagrams, the gate itself, the threaded rod that drove it, the pivot collar that allowed the rod to turn without transferring torque to the frame. She read the pages twice, then went to look. The gate was set into the upstream face at the base of the dam, accessible through a narrow maintenance shaft off the chamber's far end. She had opened the shaft door on her second day and not gone further. Now she took the lantern and went. The shaft was 4 feet wide and smelled of calcite and old iron. The gate mechanism sat at the bottom, behind a rusted access panel she worked off with the pry bar. She examined it for a long time, moving the lantern slowly. Then she tried turning the rod. Nothing. She tried with the pipe wrench. The rod moved a 1/4 inch and stopped, grinding. She tried again and felt the resistance define itself. Not the gate, not the threads, something in the collar. She went back to the journals. The second attempt, she focused on the collar directly, penetrating oil from a can on the supply shelf, applied through the gap, left for an hour, then the wrench again. The rod moved another 1/2 inch and locked hard. She sat on the floor of the shaft and looked at the ceiling. The third attempt, she read the engineering handbook first, the chapter on corrosion in pivot assemblies in intermittent use structures. The handbook was technical and dry and precise, and she read it the way she read everything, fast, without skipping. When she put it down, she knew what she needed. The pivot collar itself had corroded through in its flange, not seizing the rod, collapsing around it. Pressure from any direction would only compress it tighter. She needed to replace the flange section. It took her most of an afternoon to fabricate something workable. A bolt from the tool tin reshaped with the file into a spanning pin. A strip of tin cut from a damaged shelf bracket, bent to the correct radius with the pliers and the edge of the desk, fitted into the collar gap to bridge the collapsed section. She worked by lantern light in the shaft, hands greasy with oil, measuring by feel more than sight. When she drove the pin and tried the rod again, it turned, slowly, with resistance. But it turned. She opened the gate partway and heard, before she felt it, a sound in the pipe she hadn't heard before. A movement of pressure, then a trickle, then something steadier, consistent, real. Water ran into the stone basin in the wall. She stood there for a long time. She planted the garden in the second week of September, when the morning air had turned cold enough to show her breath, but not cold enough to harden the soil. The canyon shelf above the dam face was narrow, maybe 12 feet wide and 30 long, but the limestone had crumbled into a fine grit over it, mixed with decades of wind-blown soil, and when she turned it with the hand spade from the tool chest, it came up dark and friable underneath. The rancher had given her a coffee tin of seed packets, winter kale, a hardy radish variety, garlic cloves wrapped in newspaper. She planted everything in rows tight enough to shelter each other from the canyon wind. While she waited for the seeds to germinate, she worked on the journals. The cloth spines had dried out and cracked, pages pulling loose from the signatures. She cut strips from a worn section of the wool blanket's edge. She'd already mended the blanket's worst tears, and soaked them in a paste she made from flour and water, the only adhesive she had. She pressed each strip along a spine, clamped the journal shut with her folded road atlas as a weight, and let it cure on the desk. It took 3 days per volume, done in sequence. When she opened the first one again, the pages held. She had been drafting the petition for weeks on the backs of scrap paper before she wrote the final version cleanly on the lined paper she'd bought in town, with money earned stacking hay bales for the rancher across 2 long afternoons. She cited the original deed by file number. She cited the dissolution notice for the water district, which she'd found tucked inside the leather correspondence folder. She cited the county's own land index, referencing the specific year the re-indexing should have occurred, and didn't. She did not ask for ownership. She asked only for occupancy and use, provisional, renewable, subject to county review. She kept the language plain. She left out everything that wasn't necessary. The clerk at the records window read it once, then read it again, then took it to the back without saying anything. 3 weeks. She planted the garlic. She recaulked the stovepipe joint where cold air was seeping. She oiled the steel door hinges. She split a week's worth of wood from a deadfall she'd found on the canyon rim and stacked it inside the chamber. She stopped counting days, mostly. The letter was waiting at the post office window on a Thursday morning, a plain envelope with the county seal in the corner. Inside was 1 page. The language was formal and hedged and full of conditions, but somewhere in the middle of the second paragraph, the word provisional appeared next to the word granted. She folded it carefully, put it in her shirt pocket, walked back up the dry riverbed. She walked back up the dry riverbed the same way she always did, eyes down, reading the stone. The radishes had come in small and sharp and perfect. She'd pulled them the week before, 10 days after the letter arrived, rinsing them under the water that ran now from the sluice outlet in a clean, even thread into the stone catch basin she'd mortared herself on the canyon shelf. The kale was still going. It would go longer. Kale understood cold. The sluice gate had taken 3 weeks of work she hadn't fully planned for. Corroded linkage, a seized adjustment screw, a gasket she'd fashioned from a strip of leather cut from the caretaker's old equipment bag after searching every shelf twice. The rancher had loaned her a pipe wrench without asking what she needed it for. She'd returned it clean, with a paper bag of the first radishes. He'd taken the bag, nodded, gone back inside. That was enough. Now the water ran, not a torrent, a steady thread, cold and clear, tasting of limestone and elevation, and it ran every morning when she opened the gate, a quarter turn, and every evening when she closed it again. She climbed the 12 feet of iron ladder in the dark without thinking about it anymore. Her hands knew where the holds were. Her feet found the ledge. The steel door swung open on oiled hinges, silent now, where it had once groaned, and she stepped inside. The lantern was burning on its shelf hook. The stove had coals enough to rebuild from, and she fed it 2 pieces of the split wood and stood a moment watching the draft pull through. The pot was already on. Broth from dried beans, a handful of the kale, a pinch of the salt she'd traded 2 afternoons of fence mending for. The smell of it had already settled into the stone walls, into the wool blanket, into the desk where the journals sat neatly stacked alongside the engineering handbook and the tin of maps. All of it catalogued now in her own handwriting, on a paper she'd tacked inside the cover of the topmost journal. She had painted her initials on the door that morning. 2 letters, black paint from the tin on the lowest shelf, applied with a strip of folded cardboard because there was no brush. The paint had dried within an hour in the canyon air. She'd stood on the ledge and looked at it for a long moment before she climbed back in. 2 letters, the first permanent mark she had ever put on anything in the world. She sat down at the desk. The lamp held steady. Outside, the canyon was going dark the way canyons do, slowly at first and then all at once. But in here, the light was warm, and the walls were solid, and the water ran, and she had already begun to read.